He has to back it with action to save face.
And this is a very dangerous situation. And now he has to take some action. Right? So we have a situation of the United States or United Kingdom launching strikes against Russian internationally recognized territory, which is direct war against Russia. And the pre-existing version of the Russian nuclear doctrine didn't deter that. So it didn't deter either a proxy war or even a direct conventional war against Russia. Thus, the level of nuclear deterrence must be strengthened. Thus, it was necessary to try to convince the Western audience, the Western decision makers, that A, Russia interprets these actions, these long-range strikes into the Russian territory, as direct participation of the Western countries in this war, not just assisting Ukrainian defense, but direct participation in the war against Russia. This is a qualitatively different things. And secondly, Russia needed to convince the Western decision makers and audience that such a direct participation in war against Russia would or could ultimately escalate into a nuclear conflict, right? Because there could be a conventional escalation resulting ultimately into a nuclear conflict, that there could be some situations in which Russia would use nuclear weapons, not against Ukraine, but against the Western countries, including the United States. And that's, of course, a very dangerous situation. That's dangerous terra incognita, I would say, because we have strong doubts about the ability to control nuclear escalation. And thus, such situation must be avoided. That was the thinking. And actually, the majority of experts in the Russian think tanks seemed to believe that after Putin made the initial statements about the pending changes, the ongoing changes in the Russian nuclear doctrine back in September, that the United States would actually take this issue out of the agenda, from the agenda. Well, alas, it did not, and Biden made this decision after the US presidential election. So once more, Russia should remind the West and the United States about the dangers of this, again, direct participation of the war against Russia.
Okay, so I've got a lot of questions here. So you're saying that the doctrine, or at least Russia announced that the doctrine is being being amended back in September, and that was meant as an attempt for the West to kind of indirectly tell the West to make sure they draw the line where long-range missiles cannot be used inside Russian territory.
Right.
Now, if I want to interpret this as looking at this from the outside, I'd say that the West took this as a bluff, and they've decided to authorize the use of long-range missiles into Russian territory. As someone who's advised the cabinet, or you've advised officials on the changes for the doctrine, obviously you cannot share classified discussions, but the general theme around it, what is it meant as a show of force, as a political show of force to scare the West and even scare Ukrainians from using these missiles into Russian territory? Or are we genuinely getting closer to a tactical nuclear weapon being used by the Russian army? That's what everyone's really asked. That's what everyone's trying to understand.
Yeah, I think both. Because, yes, of course, Russia, wanted to convince the West that by changes in the Russian nuclear doctrine, that a conventional war between Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, can very easily transcend into a nuclear war. And that Russia will have a resolve and determination to use nuclear weapons against the West if we are in a state of conventional war between Russia and NATO. And now we are precisely in this changing situation when a proxy war can become a big conventional war. Because look, Russia has already stated that the West is now in a direct war against Russia, that it is the West which is directly hitting the Russian objects in Bryansk region, in Kursk region. There could be some other regions. In response to that, Russia will have to inflict material damage to the West. Russia will have to attack certain Western objects, installations, somewhere in the world, right? Not necessarily in the territory of NATO countries, but maybe even in the territory of NATO countries. And we will find ourselves in an escalatory cycle, right? Russia will do something in response to the long-range strikes of the Western countries. Then the West will do something. Then Russia will retaliate to these Western actions. So there will be a cycle of escalation, conventional escalation. And ultimately, this cycle of conventional escalation, when the escalatory steps, conventional strikes that both sides make against each other, will reach a certain point, well, Russia will identify the situation in which it could use nuclear weapons against NATO countries, right? So the point was to warn the West against doing that. And secondly, since we are already in a situation when the West has made at least 2 long-range strikes into the Russia proper, Russia, as I said, will be compelled to respond militarily against the West for doing this. We are obviously getting closer to a nuclear war because we are already finding ourselves in this escalatory cycle.
So you're based on what you're saying, according to Russia, and especially under this new doctrine, Russia is currently in conventional war with the United States.
Yes.
And that implicates NATO as well.
Yes, of course. Because as Putin said several times, the Western, American, British, and French officers actually execute these strikes against the territory of Russia proper.
And based on this new doctrine, what is the likelihood that Russia will now strike Western targets? We know that the embassy, the US embassy in Kiev, has evacuated. What is the likelihood at the moment? Is that it seems like it's almost a sure thing if long-range missiles continue to strike into Russian territory. I'm talking about internationally recognized territory.
Look, it needs to be said, of course, that Russia is not interested in escalation, right? Russia is not interested in pushing to the full-blown conventional war between Russia and NATO, pushing for the World War III. Actually, Russia is interested in a diplomatic settlement of this conflict, of course, on the Russian terms rather than on the terms which are officially stated by the West. We obviously see the interest of the Trump administration to give diplomacy a chance after January 20. And Russia obviously understands that if escalation happens today, it will be very difficult for the Trump administration to hold negotiations. And from the Russian perspective, this is precisely why the Biden administration has taken this decision, to make diplomatic settlement of the conflict less likely. Because, of course, if Russia, let's say, attacks in response to the long-range strikes into the Russian territory, right? Again, if Russia attacks with conventional weapons, I don't know, American vessel in the sea, American satellite in the outer space, American military base in Syria or in Iraq, it will be politically very difficult for the Trump administration to start negotiations with Russia on the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict.